Korea changed everything before anyone was ready. On November 8, 1950, a US Air Force pilot in a P-80 Shooting Star engaged a Soviet-built MiG-15 over the Yalu River, the first jet versus jet dogfight in history. The P-80 lost that exchange, and most of the ones that followed, but none of that diminishes what the Shooting Star was. America's first operational jet fighter, rushed through development so fast that the prototype flew less than 6 months after design work began. Lockheed built it around a British engine concept. It entered service in 1945, too late for the war that inspired it. Over Korea, it proved fast enough to be dangerous, but not fast enough to win. The age it opened was bigger than the airplane. Speed was the obvious lesson from Korea, but Republic Aviation was already thinking about range. The F-84 Thunderjet entered service in 1947 as a straight-wing jet fighter bomber with a straightforward purpose: escort heavy bombers deep into Soviet territory if war came. It flew the mission adequately. It was not elegant. Pilots described it as heavy on the controls and slow to accelerate, and its takeoff roll was long enough to become a problem on short runways. But the F-84 could carry bombs, drop tanks, and nuclear weapons on a pylon, making it for several years one of the primary delivery vehicles for the American atomic arsenal. 4,200 were built across multiple variants. When it left frontline service, nobody mourned it much. But it held the line while something better was built. No other American fighter of the early jet age left a larger footprint. The F-86 Sabre entered service in 1949 as a swept-wing air superiority fighter, and within a year it was in combat over Korea against the MiG-15, its Soviet counterpart in almost every meaningful sense. Both aircraft used captured German aerodynamic research. Both were fast, agile, and dangerous. The kill ratio favored the Sabre, though by how much has been disputed ever since. What is not disputed is what the F-86 proved: that swept wings worked, that guided missiles were not yet reliable enough to replace guns, and that pilot training mattered more than airframe performance. 9,860 were built across all Sabre and Fury variants, including licensed production. For a decade, it was the most important fighter in the Western world. Darkness had always protected enemy bombers, and the Korean War made clear that the threat of night attack was real. The F-94 Starfire was America's answer, a 2-seat all-weather interceptor derived from the T-33 trainer, armed with machine guns and later with unguided rockets arranged in a ring around the nose. It looked purposeful. Its role was to find Soviet bombers in the dark using onboard radar, close to killing range, and fire. The problem was that its rockets were inaccurate, its radar was temperamental, and the aircraft itself was essentially a trainer with a bigger engine. It served its purpose as a stopgap through the early 1950s, flying night patrols over Korea and the American mainland. It was replaced before it had a chance to prove what it could really do, or couldn't. Interception at night required 2 people, one to fly, one to manage the radar, and Northrop built the F-89 Scorpion around that premise. The aircraft entered service in 1950 as a twin-engine all-weather interceptor, large enough to carry an operator in the rear seat, whose sole job was to find the target, lock on, and call the shot. It was not fast. It was not graceful. Early versions carried rockets and guns in a nose pod that generated so much drag the aircraft could barely reach the altitude its mission demanded. Later versions solved the problem by moving the weapons to wingtip pods, where they sat until needed and then fired in salvo. Dozens of unguided rockets released simultaneously in a pattern designed to saturate a formation of Soviet bombers. The final variant carried nuclear-tipped Genie rockets, because someone calculated that accuracy was less important than yield. The Scorpion was retired in 1969. It never fired a shot in anger. That was the point. Titans of Defense on CuriosityStream.com goes deeper into exactly this: the decisions and failures behind aircraft like these, and why so many of them were built wrong the first time. Use code DVSU25 for 25% off. Link in the description. The Navy had watched Korea from carriers, and what the Navy saw alarmed it. The F-9F Panther was Grumman's first jet fighter, a chunky, straight-wing aircraft that entered carrier service in 1949 and flew combat missions from the first weeks of the Korean War. It was not fast enough to catch MiG-15s in level flight, and Navy pilots learned quickly to avoid that contest. What the Panther could do was survive. Its robust construction absorbed punishment that would have killed more elegant designs. It flew ground attack, combat air patrol, and close support. Future astronaut John Glenn flew one. Neil Armstrong ejected from one over Korea after taking a cable strike during a low-level pass. The Panther was not glamorous. It was reliable, which in carrier aviation is worth considerably more. Where the Panther was built for toughness, the Banshee was built for range. McDonnell's F-2H entered carrier service in 1948 as a twin-engine fleet defense fighter. Its two small Westinghouse turbojets nestled in wing roots that gave it an unusual silhouette and exceptional stability at altitude. It was larger than the Panther, heavier, and, in the reconnaissance variants, capable of reaching targets deep inland from the carrier. The Banshee served in Korea, flew photo missions over China, and eventually equipped Canadian carrier aviation well into the 1950s. It was not a spectacular performer, but in an era when every new aircraft was a gamble on unproven technology, the Banshee's reliability was a kind of achievement in itself. It proved that twin engines on a carrier aircraft were not a penalty. They were insurance. The Navy wanted the Sabre. That is essentially the origin story of the F-J2 Fury, a direct naval adaptation of the Air Force's most successful fighter, fitted with folding wings, a strengthened undercarriage, and a longer nose gear to keep the engine intake clear of carrier deck spray. North American delivered it to the fleet in 1952, and the result was competent without being exceptional. The swept-wing design that made the Sabre deadly over Korea gave the Fury a high approach speed that made carrier landings genuinely hazardous. Pilots learned to manage it. The more important legacy of the FJ series was what came next. Successive iterations that evolved the basic design into the FJ4, which introduced a thinner wing and genuine ground attack capability. The Fury was a bridge between propeller thinking and what the Navy would eventually demand. Before the Century series existed, there was an airplane that made it possible. The F-92A was a Convair technology demonstrator built in 1948 around one radical idea: the delta wing. Where every other fighter of its era used swept or straight wings, the F-92A flew on a broad triangular platform that offered structural simplicity, enormous internal fuel volume, and stability at high speed. The aircraft itself never entered service. It was always a test vehicle. But every pilot who flew it came back with the same conclusion: the Delta worked. Convair used what they learned to design the F-102, then the F-106. Without the XF-92A, there is no viable supersonic interceptor program in the 1950s. It appears in no combat records because it never flew combat. Its contribution was the line of thought it made possible. The F-100 Super Sabre was the first production aircraft in history to fly faster than sound in level flight, and it announced its temperament immediately. On its third flight, the prototype entered an uncontrollable roll from which the test pilot barely recovered. North American fixed the problem by lengthening the wings and tail, but the Super Sabre remained an aircraft that punished inattention. It entered service in 1954 as an air superiority fighter, was reassigned to nuclear strike when something faster arrived, and ended up in Vietnam doing low-level ground attack, a mission for which it had never been designed. Pilots flew it through surface-to-air missile envelopes at treetop height, trading altitude for speed. More than half of all Super Sabres built were eventually lost to accidents or combat. The jet age had arrived, and it was costing more than expected. McDonnell designed the F-101 Voodoo as a long-range bomber escort, a mission that was cancelled before the aircraft entered service. What remained was a large, twin-engine supersonic fighter with no clear purpose, which the Air Force then spent several years reassigning. The Interceptor variant flew nuclear-armed rockets on long patrols over Canada and Alaska, hunting for Soviet bombers that thankfully never came. The reconnaissance variant flew low and fast over Cuba during the missile crisis of 1962, bringing back photographs that confirmed the presence of Soviet missiles. Those were the most important reconnaissance flights in American history, and a Voodoo crew flew them. The F-101 never found its original mission. It found better ones. But it also demonstrated something the Air Force was slow to accept: that purpose-built aircraft outperform repurposed ones almost every time. The F-102 Delta Dagger was supposed to be a supersonic interceptor. It was not supersonic. Convair delivered the aircraft in 1953 and discovered during testing that it could not break the sound barrier in level flight, a fundamental failure for a design whose entire justification was speed. The solution came from an aerodynamicist named Richard Whitcomb, who had identified what he called the area rule. The cross-sectional area of a supersonic aircraft had to change gradually to reduce drag. Convair rebuilt the fuselage with a distinctive waist, narrowed behind the cockpit to compensate for the wide wing, and the modified aircraft exceeded Mach 1. Nearly 1,000 were built. The Delta Dagger served NORAD through the late 1950s and 1960s, armed with radar-guided missiles and unguided rockets. Its greatest legacy was the aerodynamic principle it proved. The airplane itself was a workaround for a problem that should have been solved before construction began. Convair corrected the Dagger's compromises with the F-106 Delta Dart, and the result was one of the most refined interceptors ever built. Faster, cleaner, and far more capable than its predecessor, the Delta Dart entered service in 1959 as the definitive expression of the SAGE air defense system, a computerized network that could theoretically vector interceptors to targets automatically, with the pilot serving as monitor rather than pilot in the traditional sense. That concept was both visionary and flawed. The aircraft performed superbly. Mach 2 at altitude, nuclear-armed missiles in an internal weapons bay, and handling qualities that experienced pilots genuinely admired. The Delta Dart served Air Defense Command until 1988. It was the last dedicated interceptor the United States Air Force ever operated. Because by the time it retired, the threat it was designed for had transformed into something no interceptor could intercept. McDonnell's F-3H Demon should have been a success. It had swept wings, it was designed for carrier operations from the start, and it was one of the first Navy fighters built specifically to carry air-to-air missiles rather than guns. What it had instead was the Westinghouse J-40 engine, one of the most catastrophic power plants in American aviation history. The J-40 failed repeatedly, killed test pilots, and was eventually cancelled after the airframes that relied on it had already been built. McDonnell installed a different engine and salvaged the program, but the Demon entered service underpowered and overweight, with performance numbers that embarrassed everyone involved. It flew from carriers through the late 1950s, doing the job adequately, if not impressively. Its most important contribution was teaching McDonnell what not to do, lessons they applied directly to the aircraft that replaced it. The Demon was the wrong answer to the right question. Lockheed designed the F-104 Starfighter after Kelly Johnson visited Korea and asked fighter pilots what they wanted. They said faster and lighter. Johnson gave them both, built around a T-shaped tail razor-thin wings that could slice through the air with almost no drag, and the most powerful engine that could be fitted into the smallest possible fuselage. The result flew at Mach 2 and climbed at a rate that no other operational aircraft in the world could match. It also had wings so small they generated almost no lift at low speed, making takeoff and landing genuinely lethal. West Germany lost over 110 F-104s to accidents. Taiwan lost more than 100. The aircraft earned the name the Widowmaker across 4 continents. In USAF service, it was quietly redirected away from the air superiority mission it was built for, because in that role, its limited endurance and poor low-speed handling were liabilities that no amount of raw speed could compensate for.
The largest single-engine combat aircraft the United States ever built, the F-105 Thunderchief, was designed in the 1950s for one mission: fly low and fast into Soviet territory and deliver a nuclear weapon. It was optimized so completely for that mission that everything else suffered. Over North Vietnam, where it flew conventional strike missions it was never designed to perform, the F-105 absorbed losses that would have ended any other program. Of the 833 Thunderchiefs built, 334 were lost in combat over Southeast Asia, more than a third of the total fleet. Crews called it the Thud. They flew it into the most heavily defended airspace in aviation history, armed with iron bombs against targets that had been photographed from space and defended by Soviet advisors. The aircraft held up under conditions that exceeded every design parameter. What it could not hold up under was policy that sent it back to the same targets day after day, until the pilots who knew how to fly it were gone. The aircraft that defined American airpower in the 1960s began as a Navy fleet defense fighter that no one in the Air Force wanted. The F-4 Phantom II was large, twin-engined, two-seated, and optimized for missile engagements at beyond visual range, which meant it carried no gun. The assumption was that guns were obsolete. Vietnam proved otherwise. In the early years of the war, Phantom crews with perfect aircraft and poor missiles struggled to match kill ratios that F-86 pilots had achieved over Korea with nothing but bullets and instinct. The Navy reopened Top Gun. The Air Force added a gun pod, then a gun built into the airframe. Over 5,000 Phantoms were built for 11 nations, and the aircraft flew combat from 1958 through the Gulf War. But the Phantom's most important legacy had nothing to do with what it destroyed. It was the proof that every assumption the United States had built its air combat doctrine around for a decade was wrong, and that getting those assumptions wrong cost lives. Everything that came after the Phantom was built on that lesson. The F-8 Crusader was the last American fighter designed primarily around its gun, and over Vietnam, it outperformed every missile-armed aircraft in the American inventory. Vought had given the Crusader a variable incidence wing, a mechanism that tilted the entire wing upward during takeoff and landing to generate lift without raising the nose to an angle that would have blocked the pilot's forward view on approach. It was elegant engineering that solved a genuine problem, and it gave the aircraft exceptional low-speed handling for a supersonic design. Navy pilots who flew it against North Vietnamese MiGs in the late 1960s achieved a 4-to-1 kill ratio, the best of any American aircraft in that war. They called it the last of the gunfighters. When the Crusader was retired, the Navy had already learned to accept that missiles were necessary. What they had not yet learned was that guns were too. The F-111 Aardvark was supposed to solve everything. The Defense Secretary's office wanted one aircraft that could serve both the Air Force and the Navy. Supersonic, low-level, strike-capable, carrier-based, and affordable at scale. The engineering compromises required to satisfy all of those requirements simultaneously produced an aircraft that satisfied none of them fully. The Navy version, the F-111B, was too heavy for carrier operations and was cancelled after years of effort. The Air Force version entered combat over Vietnam in 1968 and lost 6 aircraft in the first 55 missions, a catastrophic rate traced eventually to structural failures in the wing pivots. Grounded, redesigned, and returned to service, the F-111 ultimately became one of the most capable strike aircraft the Air Force ever operated. It destroyed more targets on the first night of the Gulf War than the entire 8th Air Force had hit on any single day in World War II. But the road from concept to capability cost more than anyone had projected, and the Navy never recovered what it lost in the process.
The Navy needed range. After the F-111B failure, Grumman delivered the F-14 Tomcat, a twin-engine, variable sweep fighter that could change its wing geometry in flight, sweeping back for high-speed dashes and forward for low-speed maneuver. It carried the AIM-54 Phoenix missile, capable of engaging targets 60 miles away, and an AWG-9 radar that could track 24 targets simultaneously and engage 6 at once. No other fighter in the world could do that. The Tomcat entered service in 1974 and immediately became a symbol. The aircraft from Top Gun, the photograph every carrier pilot wanted. Behind the image was an aircraft with genuine limitations, expensive to maintain, hydraulically complex, and dependent on a titanium airframe that required specialized tools to service. Iran flew Tomcats against Iraq in the 1980s, and the kill-to-loss ratio was impressive despite parts shortages. The aircraft that replaced it was cheaper and easier to maintain. It was not better at the mission the Tomcat was built for, air superiority, not multi-role, not strike-capable, not nuclear-armed. Air superiority. The F-15 Eagle was designed with a discipline that the American aerospace industry had not shown since the Korean War. No mission but one. No compromise on the requirements for that mission. McDonnell Douglas delivered an aircraft in 1972 that could outturn, outclimb, and out-accelerate everything that existed or was projected to exist on the other side. The Eagle's combat record across 4 decades is unmatched. Over 100 aerial victories without a single loss in air-to-air combat. Israeli pilots proved the airframe in the Bekaa Valley. American pilots proved it over Iraq. The Eagle was eventually given ground attack capability it was never designed for, and it performed that mission adequately too. The F-15E Strike Eagle became its own aircraft, but the original was a weapon built for one purpose, refined to a point approaching perfection, and the record it established has never been broken. General Dynamics won the lightweight fighter competition in 1975, and what they delivered changed the relationship between pilot and aircraft permanently. The F-16 Fighting Falcon was the first production fighter to use fly-by-wire controls. The stick inputs a signal to a computer, which moves the surfaces, which moves the aircraft. The airframe was deliberately designed to be aerodynamically unstable, because instability means agility. Without the computer compensating hundreds of times per second, the aircraft would simply depart controlled flight. The pilot sits reclined in a seat angled back 30 degrees, with a side stick controller that measures force rather than deflection, which reduces arm fatigue in high G maneuvering. Over 4,500 have been built for more than 25 countries. The Fighting Falcon became the most widely operated supersonic fighter in history, not because it was the most capable, but because it was capable enough, affordable, and reliable in a way that expensive aircraft rarely managed to be. The Navy had rejected the YF-17 lightweight fighter as unsuitable for carrier operations. McDonnell Douglas disagreed and spent 2 years enlarging, strengthening, and redesigning the airframe until it could land on a carrier without structural failure. What emerged in 1978 was the F/A-18 Hornet, a designation that acknowledged what the Navy had been forced to accept, that the same aircraft would need to fight other aircraft and attack targets on the ground,
because the service could no longer afford to maintain separate fleets for separate missions. The Hornet's combat radius was shorter than the aircraft it replaced. Its critics said so loudly, its pilots noted that it was reliable, its avionics were modern, and it did not fall out of the sky when the engine stalled. The Hornet flew the first combat missions of Operation Desert Storm. It destroyed an Iraqi MiG-21 with a missile, then continued to its target, dropped its bombs, and returned to the carrier. One aircraft, one sortie, 2 missions. The doctrine of specialization had not survived contact with the budget.
Northrop had built something exceptional and watched someone else win with it. The YF-17 was Northrop's lightweight fighter competition entry, a twin-engine design with leading-edge extensions and excellent sustained turn performance that lost the Air Force contract to the General Dynamics F-16 in 1975. Northrop had assumed that losing the Air Force competition was not fatal, because the Navy competition was still open. They were wrong about that, too. The Navy took the YF-17 design to McDonnell Douglas, who redesigned it substantially enough to produce the F/A-18. Northrop received a manufacturing share, but lost design authority over their own aircraft. The YF-17 itself was never built in production form. It exists in aviation history as the parent of a highly successful aircraft that carries someone else's name, which is a particular kind of achievement and a particular kind of loss. The F-111B was the Navy's version of a compromise that the Navy never agreed to. When Defense Secretary McNamara mandated a joint Air Force-Navy fighter in the early 1960s, the Navy's requirements for a carrier-based fleet defense interceptor were fundamentally incompatible with the Air Force's requirements for a supersonic, low-level strike aircraft. General Dynamics built the Air Force version and subcontracted the Navy version to Grumman. Grumman discovered that the airframe was too heavy, too large for carrier elevators, and structurally inadequate for carrier landing loads. They cut weight. They cut more weight. The aircraft was still too heavy. After 5 years of effort, the program was cancelled in 1968. The Navy used the lessons to specify what they actually needed, and Grumman built the F-14. The F-111B never entered service. Its contribution was proving, expensively, that 2 fundamentally different requirements cannot be satisfied by one fundamentally compromised aircraft. The F-117 Nighthawk was not technically a fighter. Lockheed's Skunk Works designed it as a strike aircraft, a machine that could penetrate defended airspace not by flying faster or higher than the defenses, but by reflecting so little radar energy that it was effectively invisible. The faceted surfaces that gave it its angular appearance were not aerodynamic choices, they were radar cross-section management. The aircraft was aerodynamically unstable in all 3 axes simultaneously and could only be flown by computer. Its official designation as a fighter was a bureaucratic fiction designed to obscure its nature. On the first night of Operation Desert Storm, F-117s struck 37 high-value targets in downtown Baghdad. Iraqi radar operators saw nothing. The Nighthawk proved that stealth was not a theoretical concept or a future capability. It was operational, it worked, and it had permanently changed what air defense meant. The Advanced Tactical Fighter program began in 1981, when the Air Force looked at what the Soviet Union was developing and concluded that the F-15 would not be sufficient to achieve air superiority past the mid-1990s. Lockheed, Boeing, and General Dynamics submitted the YF-22, a supercruise-capable, stealth-optimized fighter with thrust vectoring nozzles that could maneuver at angles no previous aircraft could achieve. The YF-22 flew its first flight in September 1990. The Cold War ended 2 months later. The program continued. The aircraft that emerged from it, the F-22 Raptor, was everything the Air Force had specified and more. It was also built in too small a number to fulfill the mission it was designed for,
because the threat it was built against had dissolved before the aircraft was ready to meet it. The YF-22 won the competition. What it couldn't win was timing. Northrop's YF-23 lost the advanced tactical fighter competition to the YF-22, and the aeronautics community has been arguing about that decision ever since. The Black Widow II, as the demonstrator was informally named, was faster, stealthier from front and rear aspects, and in the view of some analysts, more survivable than its competitor. What it lacked was the aggressive maneuverability that the Air Force valued. Thrust vectoring, extreme angle of attack performance, the ability to point the nose independently of the direction of flight. Northrop had prioritized stealth over close-in dogfighting capability, reasoning that a truly stealthy aircraft would never need to dogfight. That argument was technically sound. It lost the competition anyway. The two YF-23 prototypes flew for the last time in 1990 and went into storage. They are on public display today. The aircraft that defeated them is the most capable air superiority fighter ever built.
The Cold War ended before the F-22 Raptor entered service, and the aircraft spent its first decade in a world that seemed to have no need for it. Lockheed delivered a fifth-generation fighter with supercruise, the ability to sustain supersonic flight without afterburner, a radar cross-section comparable to a steel marble, an avionics suite that processes sensor fusion across multiple systems simultaneously, and thrust vectoring nozzles that allow maneuvers at angles that defeat any missile with a conventional guidance algorithm. The Air Force bought 187 of a planned 750. The unit cost averaged $350 million, with program costs pushing the figure to $428 million per aircraft when development was factored in. Critics argued it was built for a threat that no longer existed. Then, the threat began to re-emerge. In the South China Sea, over the Taiwan Strait, in the specifications of the Sukhoi Su-57 and the Chengdu J-20. The F-22 had been designed for a war that was cancelled. It may yet fly the war it was always intended for. The 46 years from the P-80 to the Raptor had produced the most capable combat aircraft in history. Whether that was enough would depend on questions that no aircraft designer could answer.